And for more insight, we're joined by Dr. Porat, who is live from Melbourne. He's a lecturer and an analyst in Middle Eastern affairs at Monash University. Now, Dr. Porat, Benjamin Netanyahu is clearly feeling the heat from all sides now. As we've heard, the poll is showing that there's a majority of Israelis now supporting a ceasefire for the release of prisoners, and also another poll is showing that a majority want him to resign after the war. So what's your view on his handling of the crisis so far, and are his days numbered?
First of all, I want to emphasize that the reason we are speaking today is because of the heinous war crimes and attack by Hamas on October 7th, the killing of children, women, taking hostages of helpless people. But going back to Netanyahu, yes, the public is that was divided on Netanyahu before October 7th because of other issues, most notably the judicial overhaul, is now mostly against him. He's lost his popularity quite significantly. And the polls are showing not that the people want a ceasefire, that the people are willing to have a ceasefire in case most of the, if not all, the hostages are returned home. It's not that there's support for ceasefire in Israel. There's none. There's actually an expectation by the population that the government will do what is necessary and is indeed expected, is to crush Hamas and destroy that dangerous terrorist organization. Now, Netanyahu, you can never write off Netanyahu, but he's in a very difficult situation now because he's being expected and he refuses to take responsibility for the failures, not only the intelligence failure, which is a complicated issue as itself, but also dividing the Israeli public before that, years before that, between left and right, between those who see him as a savior and those who see him as a criminal. I remind you that he's standing in trial for several criminal offenses. And for those who see him as responsible for the judicial overhaul, which many saw as a threat to Israel's democracy. So Netanyahu is in a very, very difficult situation, and he's acting accordingly. Trying to save his skin many times, sometimes too much. That doesn't mean he's not running the war. That doesn't mean he doesn't care or he's not functioning. It does mean that the Israeli population has very much lost faith in Netanyahu, including some of his most staunch supporters in the past.
Right. And speaking of which, we're also hearing of those tensions within Israel's political establishment as well. What's the situation like within his own government right now? And what are the forces at play here that might shape the outcome of the war?
So the government Netanyahu has now is different from the one he actually started the war with, because the leader of the centrist party, Benny Gantz, has joined the party for an emergency government, and it's sort of emboldened. But the original coalition was a very right-wing coalition. There were a lot of tensions inside that coalition. This was a coalition of that included some very dubious personnel, like the Ben-Gvir, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and Finance Minister Smotrich. And there are internal tensions because everybody's thinking about the day after. The day after would be a very deep inquiry into the question who is responsible. Now, as opposed to, let's say, the chief of staff or the chief of the internal security or the chief of intelligence that all took responsibility, the Israeli government, most ministers and most of Netanyahu's partners did not take responsibility, deflected the responsibility, and that is unacceptable and causes a lot of tensions inside the government. The question, will this government, the original one, not the emergency one, will this government survive after the war is a big question. It seems like Netanyahu is set on surviving. As remember, he's the longest serving Israeli prime minister in Israel's history, 16 years. Many of them, he actually championed or was the policymaker with regards to Hamas. So he does bear responsibility even from that very narrow perspective.
And as Netanyahu's political survival is being called into question now, who are some possible candidates emerging as a likely successor? And will they take a different stance when it comes to handling the conflict?
So the leading personality in the public figure, politician in the polls is former chief of staff and head of the centrist party, National Unity, Benny Gantz, because he has twice actually gave up his honor and went into the government to save Israel. The first time was the corona, and now this war. He's considered more moderate. And people want somebody who's more centrist and doesn't look into or tries to divide the people. Other candidates include the leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, and maybe a new candidate will come from the shadows, we don't know. But at this point, Benny Gantz seems to be the most popular, and he's also very much accepted and welcomed in the West. I would say even more than Netanyahu at this point.
And earlier also, Mr. Netanyahu told US media that a potential deal could be struck with Hamas to free more hostages. What might that deal look like? And can there be a breakthrough in the current stalemate?
It's complicated. It's complicated because the deal requires a tit for tat or sort of a confidence-building measures that have to be done one after the other. A release of a significant amount of hostages. The Hamas wanted initially to release 1 or 2 each time to slow down Israel's advance towards actually crushing them. But Israel expects at least dozens, if not 100 or more, children, women, and the most vulnerable first, people with and as in exchange, they will possibly release prisoners from Israeli prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, and will hold fighting for a day, 2 or 3. But it's complicated because there's no trust between the sides. There's no direct communication. It's all done through Qatar or through Egypt. And even the lines of communication, the physical lines of communication between the leaders of Hamas that are, traveling between Qatar, Damascus and Beirut, and the leaders on the ground, hiding cowards in the tunnels under the hospitals in Gaza. That communication is very hard, so it takes about a day or 2 to actually reach back and forth. So if a deal goes through, and I hope it does, it's going to be complicated, and it has to be involved with a lot of intermediate, like the Egyptians or maybe the International Red Cross or someone else.
Dr. Porat, thank you so much for your insights. That was Dr. Ran Porat speaking to us live from Melbourne.